Alexandra Konings to the EEB seminar today. Alexandra is coming to us from Stanford, so our neighbor to the north, and she did her undergraduate work at MIT and went on to do a master's at Duke, and then back to MIT for a PhD in civil and environmental engineering. She then spent a short time as a postdoc with time spent at Columbia and JPL, and then was hired to Stanford in 2016, where she's now in the Department of Earth System Science and also the Woods Institute for the Environment. So a lot of great colleagues in both of those departments there. Alexandra runs a remote sensing eco-hydrology lab. And so her group focuses on trying to understand ecosystems and the carbon cycle with a special focus on understanding water status of plants in the canopy and also in the background environment, and a focus on the kind of exciting remote sensing technologies to be able to do that at broader scales. And so we're going to hear a great talk today, I think, about some of the responses to the recent drought out in California. So please join me in welcoming Alexandra.
All right, well, thanks for that very detailed and great introduction, and that's exactly right. We're going to be talking about drought-driven tree mortality today, and particularly with an example in California. And I just want to, before I get started, really highlight this picture here. This is my student, Krishna Rao, who was brave enough to start with me right when I was starting out as an assistant professor, and he's really been driving all of this work. So he deserves all the credit. I deserve all the blame, depending on how you respond. And I also want to thank our other collaborators on this work, Bill Anderegg at Utah, Ana Sala in Montana, and Jordi Martinez-Vilalta in Barcelona in Spain. So like I said, we'll be talking today about drought-driven tree mortality in California and other places. And really what I want to talk about today is why vegetation water content measurements from remote sensing could be helpful in predicting that. So I'll talk a little bit first about kind of our motivations and considerations when we might be trying to model mortality. Then I'll say why we think vegetation water content is useful, which actually comes from work in this lab, and then really go on to try and prove that to you with remote sensing data. And so we have a case study here in the Sierra Nevada in the recent 2012-2016 drought. We'll give some general results, but then you'll see we really try and kind of be the most convincing by mathematically closing the loop through a machine learning model. So I'll go through all of that, but really I want to start by talking about tree mortality a little bit. And it's a pretty sexy research topic right now, so many of you know quite a bit about it potentially. But it's, I don't think, just a sexy topic because of the vagaries of the science or whatever, but actually because it seems like this is becoming more and more of a concern. And you see that sort of in a basic illustration just in this map over here. So the red dots are places from the literature where these heavy drought-driven tree mortality events have been observed. So that's not an exhaustive list by any means. It's just places where researchers happen to have data or happen to be able to get to it pretty quickly and then publish a paper on it. And you see just since 2009 with the red dots, you've basically got observations of this across all the major continents, and even more if you look at the literature further back. So it's some indirect evidence that there's a lot of these events, and indeed these events seem to be getting more frequent. Now, quantifying that is really difficult, but there's a paper in Science, I guess almost 10 years ago now, that used forest inventory data where we can get a feeling for some of those rate changes. You see here across the entire western US, you see quite significant rate increases over the last 4 or 5 decades, right? And these are not just small numbers, as you can see in California here. So, for example, 2015, 2016, at the sort of peak of the drought, you had tree mortality rates of 6-7%. Now, that might seem like a no number to you, but if you actually think about it, you have 15 years of intense drought like that, and now you've suddenly killed off all the trees, or almost all of the trees. So these are really significant rate in capture mortality rates of junipers in New Mexico in the big drought there earlier this century. And so you see, some of you might know, this is one of the most well-studied sites when it comes to issues like plant physiology and tree mortality. And even at a place like that, these different models, if you look at plant loss conductivity, for example, they're disagreeing with each other quite widely. If you're looking at the loss of non-structural carbohydrates that might underlie carbon starvation, again, the models disagree with each other quite significantly. And indeed, if we compare those different models with different colors here to the black dots, which are observations, none of them seem to really be matching the observations either. So there's just still enough uncertainty in the plant physiology, which hopefully some of you guys can solve down the line. But right now, we can't really do a great job with these. So the other approach I mentioned is to try and use these empirical approaches. And generally what people do for that is they come up with some climate metric or another and then relate mortality rates to that particular climate. So a really commonly used one is this climatic water deficit, for example. It's just the difference between the potential evapotranspiration in a certain region and the actual evapotranspiration. You could put 50 plots like this up there with 50 different sort of primarily climate-based metrics. The FDSI that I talked about earlier is another example. So you have this sort of manifold of different climate drivers, many of them, as you see here, with no offense to this particular study, many of them are as noisy as these, and ultimately they're all climate metrics, so they're not going to take into account the fact that different plants respond differently to water stress, and that perhaps depending on where you are, a certain climate might translate to differences in soil water availability as well. So what I'll sort of try and argue today is that there's basically, I've just talked about these disadvantages, that there's basically a different way with remote sensing that we can kind of combine these methods. So if we look at vegetation water content, we potentially have the ability to account for differences in vegetation response across species, just like the physiologic models do, but without the need to really have measured a gazillion species in order to be able to run them at large scales. And to do that, we use this idea of looking at vegetation water content as a relevant variable. And the reasoning for that is actually primarily driven by work coming out right here at UCLA in Lawrence Sachs' group. So this is one example of a paper that his, former student Megan Bartlett now wrote about 5 years ago in Ecology Letters. And what they did was they took more than 300 different species and went and measured different traits at the point of leaf turgor loss, and then divided those species up based on the biome in which they are, just to get a sense of sort of the variability. So you see on the left here the sort of potential at turgor loss, classic leaf trait, varied quite a bit across different biomes. But if instead you look at the relative water content as a pure sort of volumetric amount relative to its maximum, you have much more consistency in what appeared to be the threshold for turgor loss. And in fact, even within a biome, much less variability, as you can sort of see on the error bars. So that suggests to us that there might be some hope of getting some sort of applicability of these thresholds to large heterogeneous landscapes so that we can really predict tree mortality at larger scales. But of course, these are leaf scale measurements in the lab. That's a long way off from the landscape. So we go maybe one step up, and our collaborator Anna Sala in Montana actually has more promising results on relative water content. So these are saplings of, I believe, ponderosa pine grown in a greenhouse and then dehydrated. And then they really looked at the mortality rate as a function of vegetation water content. And so you see that there's a pretty close relationship here that's a little bit, not dramatically so, but still a little bit closer than that with percent loss of conductivity. And what's particularly interesting is you have this clear threshold, right? Again, much like in the last slide, and unlike in the case of loss of conductivity. And so if we have a threshold, that gives us some hope that we could go in and find all the areas below that threshold and really say where mortality rates might be high. Of course, the problem is that relative water content is still something that's spatially variable, and that's really where the remote sensing comes in. So as somebody whose background is primarily in remote sensing, I get really excited when people find uses for vegetation water content, because that happens to be something that we can directly measure, unlike almost all other plant physiological sort of parameters or traits. And so the way we do that is through this variable that I'll keep referring to as VOD, as the vegetation optical depth. And I want to just make sure that you're all on the same page as me and go through a little bit where that VOD comes from, so you really understand what some of the advantages and disadvantages might be. So what VOD is a variable that we get when we look at radiometry. And radiometry is just going to measure the gray body emission of the land surface, that same gray body emission that every single object, including my sweater or this bottle of water, gives off at any time. And if we look at that in the right frequency range, in this case the microwaves, then you're primarily sensitive to the amount of water in the land surface. So people use this primarily as a measure of soil moisture. But when those waves are emitted from the soil, they pass through vegetation. They get attenuated. And that vegetation attenuation affects the signal and is quantified by this VOD. And it's again something that depends on the water content. Now, people have only been using this VOD for science for a couple years, but the nice thing is that people have been using microwave radiometry for soil moisture for basically decades now. And so there's all of these sort of electrical engineers and other types doing really careful measurements of this vegetation attenuation just for the sake of getting better soil moisture data. And so if you actually go back to the literature from the 80s, from the early 90s, you see that there's a lot of really careful fieldwork and theoretical predictions that all show that this VOD is not just related to vegetation water content, but it's actually nicely linearly related, where you have some constant coefficient B that really depends on sort of the geometry of the plant. So could be influenced by something like canopy height or allometry, or a bunch of variables that biologists might not typically measure because they're really related to sort of the electromagnetics of the waves. But that B thing, even though it's spatially variable, there is theory to suggest that it's temporally constant in this linear relationship, which is generally promising. Things are easier when they're linear, right? So VOD is kind of interesting because, like I said, people have been using it more and more the last couple years. And nobody ever really uses it as a metric of vegetation water content in the literature. So a lot of people use it as an estimator of biomass, right? Because you're measuring the overall water, and that's going to scale with biomass, as I'll come back to. In my group, we've published a couple papers where we've tried to point out that water stress probably also affects the vegetation water content. But we actually usually use some hand-wavy arguments to relate that to leaf water potential. And then we do things like estimate variability, spatial variability in drought response across the world. So I don't really have time to go into this. Please ask me if you're interested in some more of these studies. But again, we say, oh, normally people use leaf water potential. Let's try and relate this to leaf water potential. What's nice about this potential mortality application is that relative water content, vegetation water content, might actually play a much more direct role. So that's kind of summarized here, just to make sure everything is crystal clear, right? Again, the way that I'm sort of thinking and that Krishna's been thinking about vegetation water content here as a relative water content for a given location that scales with the biomass of that particular remote sensing pixel. And for the sake of this study, we'll actually assume that biomass is relatively constant. And that allows us to potentially get rid of it and really isolate this relative water constant. So it's potentially a direct metric of things that there's some really suggestive evidence showing is related to tree mortality, but there's one pretty major downside to VOD data, and that is that relative to other remote sensing types, they are pretty coarse in resolution, right? So they have the advantage of being a direct water measurement. They have other advantages related to the fact that they can pass through clouds and things like that. But you want to study a case like California, you get an example map of relative water content that looks something like this. So clearly you're not going to use this to predict tree mortality in individual stands. So instead what I'll do today is I'll just try and see if we can use Krishna's model to predict the rate of mortality in a given one of these 25 kilometer by 25 kilometer pixels. And again, just to sort of be clear here, the point is really that we hope that we have now a variable that is easy to parameterize and use across large spatial scales, because it's something that we get from remote sensing data, and that also has the advantages of actually accounting for differences like differences in hydraulic traits that is sort of encapsulated in this measurement without us having to estimate it a priori. So let's go and apply this to this example of California. And now I've sort of divided these results into two slides. I'll talk a little bit about how we went about doing this overall first and what data we use, so on and so forth. But then really the meat of Krishna's work has been in building a machine learning model to do these predictions. And the reason we do that is because we wanted to really show off the value of this data set. And we don't trust ourselves to build the best possible model, or to really be fair if we compare vegetation water content to other possible models, that we're using the best possible alternative models. So what we've done is we've just built a statistical model, so let the math take care of sort of doing the best possible regressions or predictions, and then we'll see what that optimal model actually looks like. But to do that, we need good training and testing data. And in this particular case, we focused on California in part because it's relevant and a large area, right? Some of you guys might have heard the 100 million trees dead in the last drought statistics. That was all over the news. But the other reason we use California data is because we have this great aerial detection survey data from the Forest Service. And so for those of you not familiar with that data set, really what's happening is that every year some trained observer from the Forest Service goes out, or actually I think it's multiple observers, go out and they sit in a plane, and that plane painstakingly flies over the entire mountain range, and somebody goes and looks, hey, that sort of stand of tree over there looks completely defoliated or decolored or whatever, discolored rather, and will, using their specific knowledge of that ecosystem, mark that as dead. So it's a super painstaking process, and I don't want to minimalize it at all because it's great and really useful, but you can also imagine it's not really perfect, and that you're not going to capture individual trees when you're doing something like that. Well, conveniently, we only have this coarse resolution VOD data anyway. So again, this data set, at least for estimating the rate of mortality based on talking to people in the Forest Service, should be pretty good. So we have this data over the recent drought, and then we have VOD data from satellites over that same period and location. So in this case, I forgot to mention it in the slide here, but in this case we use data from something called the AMSARI satellites. What's really nice is they go back, and that scales with biomass, and it might be difficult to estimate how that biomass varies across the entire state a priori. And so in this case, since we have some nice promising results from the lab right here about relative water content, we're just going to normalize this VOD, taking advantage of that linearity to really look at relative water content. And the way to do that is kind of summarized in this figure from a sample pixel right here. So we take, first of all, we're looking only at summers as sort of the most predictive time period. We average over a summer in each case, and then what we do is we find sort of in this case, let's see, it's kind of disappeared from this plot. But you can find, for example, here the lowest point in the summer and the highest point, and those you'll use to normalize on a pixel-specific basis. Now, for the sake of visualization, it's been smoothed out in this time series, but for various sort of technical remote sensing reasons, there's a fair amount of high-frequency noise in this raw VOD data set. So just to make sure we're not overly sensitive to outliers, we use these percentiles here. So we have what we think is a pretty robust normalization procedure that's really location specific and gets us exactly at relative water content. And then we can start by just taking a basic look and comparing relative water content to the mortality rate. And that's shown in this scatter plot on the left here. Now these are thousands of points all in the scatter plot, so the coloration here is just by the point density in any given location, just so you can kind of get a sense of all of these points at once. And so you see, indeed, that there seems to be a relationship. It's not perfect, right? There's a few places that are pretty wet from a relative water content point of view and still have much higher than normal mortality rates. But for the most part, the mortality rates really sort of shoot up at these low relative water content areas. And what's particularly interesting and kind of shown in this red stepwise regression here is you have that threshold behavior, right? So that threshold is shown right here in the vertical line. And that line might look a little jagged. It's actually jagged because there's a confidence interval hidden in there that's just really small because there's such a clear threshold being shown in the data. And so just to give you a sense of kind of what the scatter in this really means, we went ahead and created a similar plot for climatic water deficit. If you remember, that's one of the things I mentioned earlier as sort of a climate empirical predictor that people have used for mortality, and that seems to be used quite commonly. So we look at that. Well, first of all, our axes now are reversed, right? Because climatic deficit means that if it's a high value, you're relatively dry, unlike the relative water content. But aside from this sort of, x-axis flip, if we look at this more closely, we see that it doesn't do nearly as well as the relative water content, right? You still get maybe a general increase as climatic water deficit increases. But if you squint at this closely, it actually looks like the mortality rates go down again at the highest climatic water deficits, which makes no sense. And you lose this sort of threshold predictive capacity as you see in the extremely wide confidence interval here. So by itself, the relative water content is not perfect, but it seems to be doing better than purely climatic indices as we sort of expect. And while we're in the sort of scatter plot mode, what Krishna also did that's particularly interesting is to check sort of how variable this threshold is. Now, we don't really have good species data across the entire range, but we can use land cover data from just optical remote sensing to get a sense of leaf habit in different places, at least. And if you do that and you look at the patches of mortality for just evergreen and deciduous trees, and you calculate a different mortality rate for these different patches, as Krishna did, you actually find that the threshold for these two leaf habits is at almost exactly the same points. And that harkens back exactly to what we saw in Megan Bartlett's original sort of motivating paper for using relative water content. So it's consistent with these leaf level measurements, and it's particularly useful for this remote sensing application because at 25 kilometers, or even at the 30 meters that an optical data set might give you, you're invariably going to be averaging over different species quite often. And so having some sort of consistent threshold here is really super encouraging, at least in my mind. All right, so I mentioned, we have this sort of basic results that give us some confidence, but really to get a quantitative idea of how much this relative water content is doing in the sea of different mortality prediction studies out there, we went ahead and built this machine learning model, right? And so the idea is just to say, look, let the math take care of the modeling, and then see if that relative water content is actually an important predictor in the sort of optimal math world. And so when I say optimal math, what I mean specifically is a so-called random forest model. So I swear Krishna was not just trying to get a pun, but the random forest, right? Some of you might know this is an established machine learning technique. And I just want to walk you through it to see kind of why it works. And the reason it's called a random forest is because it's based on these decision trees, as you see an example sort of in the right here. So this is just an example to get you used to this. Let's imagine a scenario where I'm trying to predict a land cover type, and the information I have is the canopy height, and some index of, you know, greenest seasonality or something. And I know it's going to be either a grassland or an evergreen forest. So what the decision tree will do is it'll go through your different inputs and then find different thresholds for different input combinations that say, okay, if you're in this sort of regime in the multidimensional input space, in this case just 2 dimensions, this is your likely land cover type. So we'll say, okay, if I have, you know, a 30-meter canopy, then I'm pretty sure it's not going to be a grassland, and so likely it's a forest. If I don't have a 30-meter canopy, it's not quite as clear a priori, and then I go to the seasonality information. And so these decision trees, they'll go through and they'll find the sort of ordering of inputs and the thresholds that will kind of optimize your prediction based on some set of training data where you tell it, okay, these are the inputs, and for this particular sub area, we know what the mortality is. And so there's definitely some clear benefits to this approach, right? It's relatively easy to use and easy to explain in a talk. And a key advantage over many other machine learning models that's particularly applicable here is it's robust to giving it a bunch of extra information that doesn't actually help your prediction. So we can imagine, and in fact you'll see we will, all kinds of different climatic or vegetation or topographical drivers, and we want to be able to just throw it at the model and have it pick the relevant ones. And if you do that with, you know, things like neural networks or something like that, you might end up confusing the model, but that's not quite the case as often for decision tree based approaches. What these decision trees do is they tend to overfit, right? So you give it a training data set with a bunch of noise. That decision tree does so good at modeling that training data set that it basically ends up also modeling the noise because it doesn't know what's noise or not. And then you give it a bunch of other data that's not your training data. You actually use the model for its intended purpose. And now it's predicting a bunch of that noise that obviously is going to degrade the quality of your predictions. So to do that, we use this random forest where we take a bunch of decision trees and make them into a forest. And for each decision tree, one of the things that gets done is you subsample the training data to kind of reduce the effect of that noise and that overfitting. What's particularly interesting for this application about random forest is it's also quite common to then go back and sort of use these decision trees and permute or use random values for some of the inputs, and then see, okay, if I change input number 1, how much does my prediction vary? If I change input number 5, how much does my prediction vary? And if you do that in these sort of standard ways of quantifying things, you can get a sense of how important each of these predictors actually is for your ultimate, in this case, mortality prediction. So we really like the random forest approach exactly for that reason. And what Krishna did is he went and he compiled, in this case, 25 different data sets. Please don't spend too much time trying to squint and read that whole table, right? But I just wanted to put it up here to give you a sense of how much we've thrown at this model to really try and make it find as much data as possible that would show that you could do this without relative water content, right? And so we sort of have 3 different classes of data types. We have all kinds of different climatic drivers. We have as much vegetation info as we can reliably get across the entire landscape with remote sensing. And we have various sort of topographic measures that might give you a sense of water availability. And again, I told you not to go through it, but you know, relative water content is in there. The climatic water deficit that people use is in there. So we use all of these things. We throw them in the random forest, and then we try to predict our fractional area of mortality. And the good news is, it seems like we do that relatively well, as you see in the spatial pattern sort of shown with time here. So the top row here is the actual observed mortality rate from, again, these airborne survey data. And then the bottom row is our predictions with the random forest model. And so you see, that unfortunately only goes up to 2015 because of processing limitations in the remote sensing. But even in 2015, you know, that's when you had the most intense mortality over this particular period. And we roughly get the spatial pattern right that we see in the observations. Same thing in years that weren't quite as intense as 2015, right? So 2010, for example, you can kind of see in the Northeast here, both in the predictions and the observations, you see some mortality. 2014, it's a little further south. Again, you match the observations pretty well. So that gave us some courage for believing in this. All right, and then we can go in and actually look at these results statistically, not just by what the eye tells us. And you get an R-squared of about 0.5. Now, depending on your background, that may or may not seem like a lot. In the context of these mortality predictions, it's actually pretty good. I mean, there's a paper published just last year, I think, that has an R-squared of 0.2. You know, things like 0.3, 0.4 certainly seems to be about the state of the art. So we're actually doing a little bit better than that, even if not dramatically so by our approach. And I think that's actually pretty good if you also consider the disadvantages that we have here, right? We have a 0.25 degree pixel, so there's just a dramatic amount of nonlinearity that we're averaging over. We're using these mortality data that are imperfect, and then we're using, you know, and this is partially, of course, the fault of the model, but we're using a model that relies on training data. And thankfully for all of us, you don't have that much mortality relative to pixels where you have low mortality, right? You can see this here in the test bed. These test data are different from the training data, by the way, just to be clear. But you can see, you know, most of these points are relatively low mortality. So you end up with a model that's trying to fit just a few training points of high mortality rates, and that's inevitably going to mean it's not perfect. But again, still, you know, all told, we're doing relatively well. And really what gets me the most excited about these results is not just that we can make a model for a specific region, but that this model really shows off the importance of the relative water content. So I know this is a lot of stuff on the left here. Again, you don't need to go through all of it. But what's being shown here is that variable importance determined by the model for all the different input variables, colored, again, by different type. And so there's just a couple that I want to point out here. One is the relative water content, sitting right at the top is the most predictor. Even when we throw all other possible information at it, the relative water content here, in this sort of normalized sense, is actually more than twice as important to the prediction as the second most important variable, which in this case is the elevation. By contrast, our climatic water deficit, as sort of the state-of-the-art climate driver, is sitting right down below in number 5. So again, to me, this really shows off that we're on the right track, thinking that remote sensing of relative water content could potentially be useful. There are some caveats. I've tried to be pretty clear about those throughout the talk, but there's, you know, just a couple more considerations I wanted to throw out there. And one is that ideally you would want a model of mortality that is actually predictive, right? You have some warning sign of mortality being likely in a given region. We're not really doing that here. We're looking at summer mortality and summer water content in the exact same time. That's future work that we're hoping to get to. Part of the reason we're doing that for this particular study is because it would be pretty difficult to apply to these airborne survey mortality data. And you see that in this particular figure here. So what's being shown here is for a given year, the month in which the actual mortality flights over each region we're done, right? And it might be a little bit hard to read this legend in the back there, I apologize. But, you're varying between July and October depending on where you are. So unless you start subdividing based on this, doing a sort of predictive model would be pretty difficult. The other sort of more general, beyond this study, limitation here is that if we want to get a sense of how much worse these mortality events are going to be in 2100, for example, we can't really do that directly with relative water content. I think part of the reason I'm excited about the remote sensing potential of this variable is that it's really a time where, if you look at large-scale models, people are finally starting to include plant hydraulics, but most of the current ones don't. We're still a ways off from getting to a point where we can reliably predict, where we can even start to hope to predict what relative water content might look like under future climate scenarios or ensembles. So we can't really go in and use this to tell anything about mortality rates in the future. That doesn't mean it's useless, because it's still potentially of benefit to forest managers, right? Even if I only know where mortality is happening or might happen in the near future in a given location as a forest manager, that might help me figure out where I want to do some last minute stand thinning in an effort to try and make things a little better, or where there's going to be a lot of dead trees and where I might go try and clear some fire fuels to try and avoid the worst of that. So there are, I think, still benefits to these kind of modeling results. And then the last kind of key limitation, which I think was hopefully pretty clear to all of you, is that this VOD resolution is really kind of our Achilles heel, right? 25 kilometers is just pretty terrible when you're trying to predict events like mortality, which never happen on such large scales. There's still quite a bit of work to be done on this front that we're doing right now, but there is some hope, right? So there's these things called synthetic aperture radar data that are also, in theory, sensitive to vegetation water content, and they, for various reasons, have dramatically higher resolution. So this microwave radiometry that gets us our VOD, the state of the art there is like 3 to 9 kilometers in terms of resolution. With SAR, we can get down to 100 meters or so. So we're not quite at the point where we can fully account for those vegetation geometry effects, right, that influence that B in the radiometry case. You have something analogous with the radar. But we're working on it, and if we can unlock sort of that mystery, suddenly we'll potentially have dramatically more useful data, right? You imagine one radiometry pixel, this is about the same scaling of resolution, we'll end up looking something like this in terms of variability. So hopefully you agree with me that there is a lot of potential in relative water content from remote sensing, despite sort of the limitations. So I'll just leave these conclusions up and maybe see if there's any questions. Right.
And do you think there'd be any increase in accuracy if you integrated multiple kind of remote sensing data sets?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take those one at a time. In terms of comparing to, shall we say, non-microwave remote sensing methods, other than the resolution drawback, there are these advantages, right? Is the fact that you're directly sensitive to water content. Like if you actually look at what's causing the electromagnetic waves to vary, it's water content. And all of these hyperspectral type methods, you can try and find some index that's linked to that, but it's never really a direct measurement. And so the other then key advantage that's a little bit less important for this application, but still there to reduce noise is you can see, you penetrate through clouds unlike other methods. So particularly for soil moisture that's huge, if you're trying to do drought sensitivity studies, I'll just give a general plug for these radiometry methods, right? If you're away from mortality or a slow process like mortality, and you're looking at vegetation water content, it's really useful to be able to penetrate through clouds. And even for an application like this, it just helps you, when you have spaceborne data, average out over time periods and be a little bit more robust. And so that's the other advantage, at least of our hyperspectral methods, which is that we have, because of soil moisture, because these satellites are also sensitive to ocean wind speeds, we have these long records going back. Hyperspectral, there's currently no space satellites measuring this. You're really limited to airplane flights when you have those, and they're pretty expensive. So that's the general remote sensing picture. And then in terms of trying to merge those, I think that's a great idea. So just to kind of go back to this issue of the SAR a little bit, right? The concern is that we know that water content influences it, and we know that the geometry of the vegetation influences it, and the radar, unlike the radiometer, is more sensitive to that vegetation geometry. And the problem is that just loses your sort of advantage that you have of being able to normalize things and not needing all of these specific, parameters depending on the species, things like that. So optical data, hyperspectral data, if we have it, is also going to be sensitive to that vegetation geometry. So in fact, one of the ways that we think we can go forward with this to try and get at vegetation water content with SAR is to use a machine learning approach where we basically also input a bunch of optical data to get at exactly that. So yeah, it's a great idea. Other questions?
I have a question about your machine learning model.
Okay.
So I'm kind of interested in how unsupervised or supervised your model was. Did you feed it any priors in the training, or did you just try to let it work out that high-low gradient on its own?
Yeah, so there's no priors, but it is supervised, right? So I want to say it was a pretty high, at least when you go back and you look at the machine learning literature, you see this as a normal number, but at first blush it often sounds like it's a high. So I think we gave it 60% of the data as training data in the end, right? So it is pretty highly supervised. And so one of the things that we also need to do is extend this beyond California, see how well you do this when you're not training it on data from exactly that drought event in exactly that region. But there's no priors. We just let the model figure out what the best way to predict things is, just with a massive amount of data thrown at it. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, really cool stuff. So I might have missed this when you were talking about point 1 here, but I'm curious whether there's space for lag effects or considering the history of a system.
Yeah, definitely. So if we can, the short answer is yes. And in fact, we sort of expect it, but it's not in these models in a very direct way, right? So I'm trying to sort of stall here because I think there's two potential ways of taking your question, which is it in here, and is it something that we could modify this to do? And so it is partially in here, but it's also partially conflated by the fact that mortality is such a slow process that actually probably quite a bit of the error in this data set is actually you sort of not being able to quite get the increment right? And you also have the flight only once a year, so did this tree die recently? Did it die a year ago? Is it quite dead yet? And you have a negative lag. So that's kind of limiting our ability to really use this to try and infer science about maybe how important those lag effects are. But I don't think I have it in the backup slides here. Krishna actually at one point ran this model with only using relative water content from the year before rather than that same summer, and I think also then 2 years before that. And you do that and you don't get sort of a dramatic reduction in performance. The spatial patterns still look pretty good. Statistically you drop your R² by 0.1 or something. So that suggests that there's definitely some room for looking at lagged effects, if only to try and understand how much, conditions 3 years ago actually affect mortality down the line. Again, perhaps it would be easier to do that if you had better mortality data. But yeah, so that's one thing. And I think the other aspect, the nice thing, kind of coming back to the remote sensing question, is the nice thing about having these long time series of relative water content as a directly relevant variable. You can start seeing if you can kind of come up with these like early warning signals, and that's a whole separate analysis that we haven't done yet, but that obviously directly gets at lagged effects as well. So.
Actually, one quick question. So it seemed like in your model, if I remember right, you were tending to under-predict the high mortality.
Right.
So is that just a training issue, or do you think there's something that is biologically different about the triggers for those really high mortality events? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
It's certainly possible that there's something biologically different, that relative water content sort of threshold or relative water content predictive information breaks down. I don't. Yeah, I mean, so that's another issue, right? As we like try to have this, is there an insect factor that only comes in? I think it's just really hard to tell from something like this because the training issue is so enormously large. So again, maybe if we had better mortality data, I know this is like a crutch I keep coming back to, but it's a real issue. We could try and get at some of that. But my understanding, and hopefully one of the things I'll find out as I talk to folks here this afternoon, is that at least on the in situ measurement side, other than maybe through something like insects or something where you have an unrelated cause of death rather than hydraulic failure or carbon starvation, there's no real reason to expect that breakdown. Although somebody should correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding.
Any other questions? All right, please join me in thanking the Center for Great Talk.